Good morning or good afternoon. My name is Becky Steckler, and I am the Program Director at the Urbanism Next Center at the University of Oregon. I know folks are continuing to come online, so I'm going to just say a few remarks before we get into our program, which I'm very excited about. So the webinar today from Empty to Active is part of our speaker series that we've been doing since our last virtual forum last spring. And so today I'm really thrilled to work with some amazing architects in the private and academic sector that are really thinking about our public spaces. And in just a moment, I'll hand it over to Scott Clarke, who's going to talk a little bit more about what to expect today. But for right now, I do want to thank our partners and sponsors. We've been working with the both the Oregon, the professional associations of the American Institutes of Architects, the American Planning Association, the Urban Land Institute, and NUMO, the New Urban Mobility Alliance, at both the local state level here in Oregon, as well as the national level. For most of those organizations, and also the American Society of Landscape Architects in Oregon. We also have some wonderful sponsors that help to support these webinar series, including NUMO, Uber, the Knight Foundation, Tool Design, Perkins & Will, Lyft, Echo Northwest, the Oregon Transportation Growth Management Program at the Oregon Department of Transportation and the Department of Land Conservation and Development. I think they get the award for the longest title. Kittleson and Associates, Ankrum Moyson, Mithun, Ulta, Fair and Peers, Parametrics, and Arup. So I just want to thank all of them for continuing to support the Urbanism Next Center and these efforts with our partners. Also in today's webinar, if you do have any questions for the speakers, please put those into the question and answer. And with that, I am thrilled to hand it over to Scott, Karin, and Conrad. So Scott, take it away.
Thank you, Becky. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm really looking forward to this presentation. I think we've got two fantastic presenters that can talk us through some of these issues about the potential of reusing buildings in different ways. So, and I'm going to start by kind of stating the obvious. We are in the midst of the worst health crisis in a century. And, hopefully we're making some progress. If this is a football game, maybe we're entering the fourth quarter, knock on wood, hopefully. We have a ways to go, but we're at the point where we can start to basically look back a little bit. And so these are all things we all know, that the consequences of this pandemic are manifold. Certainly there's tremendous equity issues. We know that Black and Latinx populations are 2.8 times more likely to die from this disease, and four times more likely to be hospitalized. We've seen lots of results of our systemic racial inequity in our country. We've seen that recently this summer in lots of protests, including those following the incident with George Floyd. We have extreme political polarization to the extent that I think it's not unreasonable to say that we have large segments of the population that don't agree on the basic tenets of reality, that we are operating in very different psychological spaces. And that perhaps has been exacerbated by our physical separation, both as a function of this pandemic and also as a function of the way our cities are and our environments in general are ordered. And we have technological segregation perhaps as well, that we can connect with things easily, but we can also choose what we connect with easily. And information tends to become siloed. All of this is underlaid by, of course, our continued climate crisis, which has been manifest recently in erratic weather, temperatures, storms, all those kinds of things. So then, there's an economic and technological context as well. Notably, 42% of us in the United States are working full-time from home, which is an absolutely unprecedented thing and has obvious ramifications for things like offices, office space. We have, and Conrad is going to talk about this, I think, fairly extensively, a historical decline in the prominence of retail this goes way back, and is certainly going to be accelerated by current events. And we have a lot of the issues that Urbanism Next tends to talk about a lot, like e-commerce and the nature of the change of retail, moving towards retail uses that are experiences more than products. And this all has to do with a lot of mobility issues. Also, ride sharing, autonomous vehicles, the role of public transit, all those things are wrapped up into to our current condition. So, you know, we're dealing with climate change, but I think that we are also perhaps in a moment of a climate of change, that we have the opportunity, I think, to use this disruption to help maybe move things to a different place. You know, as tragic as this whole thing has been, imagine extending that tragedy by failing to leverage the potential for change that this moment brings. We have the ability to do things differently. You know, we've all shared, we have shared experience of doing things in very different ways. And my experience and what I've heard from others is that often it works out much better than we expected it would have. And so, you know, when we get to the more specific issue of unused and underused buildings, the kind of questions that we could ask would be, you know, how could interaction with these buildings affect equity, health, economic vitality, environmental responsibility, and social connection? Can the pandemic inform our decisions about reimagining urban spaces? So our two guests today are approaching these issues in two very different and delightfully complementary ways. We have someone from the academic realm and someone from the realm of practice, both dealing with fairly similar issues. I would also like to add that this webinar I represent the AIA on the Urbanism Next board. And so this is an architect-focused event. To some extent, we think that it has broad appeal to all sorts of disciplines. But it's important to note that both of our guests today are from the background of architecture and urban design. But architecture plays a prominent role in both of their perspectives. Our first guest today will be Conrad Kickert, who's assistant professor of urban design at the University of Cincinnati. His research focuses on the shape and shaping of cities and their effect on the current working of cities. He also is interested in changing the relationship between urban form and the ground floor economy. He's done extensive research concerning the city of Detroit. Research topics include the American streetcar suburb, active centers, interactive edges, and the urban shopping arcade. He holds several degrees, including a PhD in architecture from the University of Michigan, and also degrees in urbanism, urban design from schools in the United States and also his native Netherlands. He will soon be editing a peer-reviewed journal issue on the post-commercial Main Street and has an upcoming book called Street Level Architecture, the Past, Present, and the Future of Interactive Frontages with Routledge. Karin Lilijegren, who was recently elevated to fellow in the AIA, so congratulations, Karin. She is the founder and principal of Omgivning, which is a firm in Los Angeles that is focused on adaptive reuse of all sorts of buildings at all sorts of scales, as you will see. Her interests also include development, product design, and advocacy. She, from what I gather, seems to be very active in designing all sorts of things, including her firm culture, which encourages the intellectual investment of all of her diverse staff and encourages them to be proactive in reflecting, in allowing the firm to reflect their own passions and interests. She holds a Master of Architecture degree from UCLA and Bachelor's of Architecture from UNC at Charlotte. So with that, I would like to turn this over to Conrad.
Great, thanks very much, Scott. Let me share my screen here. Here we go. So what I would like to talk to you today about is life after commerce. And I think Scott did a pretty good introduction that I probably don't really need to repeat, right? So we are talking about adaptive reuse very much today, and very much focused on commercial properties. And even before COVID began, you saw a massive decline in the amount of retailers, for instance, as expressed by this empty Toys R Us store over here. What's interesting is that this sort of retail apocalypse, as it has been declared, was very much proclaimed in the past couple of years, so even before COVID. But if you think about cities, urban retail streets have been seeing retail decline for decades. And this is part of a much longer term pattern. In fact, what I want to show here in this graph is, like many other countries, the United States has measured the amount of retail establishments since about the 1930s, the late 1920s, 1929. And the per capita amount of retail establishments has been going down pretty much since records began in the 1920s. You know, those little corner stores have been eaten up until they went to Toys R Us, and then Toys R Us died an unfortunate death as well. So the number of retail establishments has been on the decline because of fewer larger stores, and yes, also because of e-commerce. And now, of course, we are looking at that sort of post-apocalyptic world during COVID. By the way, the graph you see here doesn't have that COVID influence in there yet. It takes a while to build statistics. But we all know the results, especially in cities. Vacant storefronts. I mean, for years, most designers, planners, and policymakers have really focused on just finding that new business or finding a pop-up business. And surely things will pick up if you have the right vision or the right design. Or what about bars and restaurants, which has really rescued urban retail storefronts for years with the rise of the experience economy? I agree with Scott, is that we are probably not looking at continuing past patterns. We are looking for a new normal, perhaps a great reset. No, these storefront vacancies are no longer temporary for many of these urban streets. My presentation, and what I would really like to focus on, is specifically these urban storefronts. Karin's story will be much broader than mine, but I really want to work on the city at eye level. The reason I really want to focus on urban storefronts is I find them to be the key to walkable, sustainable, and sociable and equitable environments. Very understudied topic, by the way, internationally. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is essentially new ideas for these urban storefronts post-commerce, post-retail, post-transaction. The first step to this, just like perhaps any of these meetings that you may know, like an AA meeting, acceptance. Post-commercial storefront futures fuel a sense very much of political loss. Politicians don't really like talking about post-commercial futures, but I think increasingly they are and will have to accept this new normal. What's really interesting, and I'll show a lot of examples in this presentation, is the United Kingdom has really been leading the way in this regard. They have a kind of combination of acceptance of, yes, their high streets, their version of the main street, is indeed going into a post-commercial future. They're also putting money where their mouth is. They're putting money for innovation. They have a future high streets fund, £25 million for each town that applies to this fund to really think of post-commercial reuses for storefronts. They have a high streets task force. And again, from the top level to the bottom level, the Brits really understand that they need to think of post-commercial uses. Here's the bigger issue. So let's say the politicians are on board, is the issue of financial loss. Transforming vacant storefront to non-retail uses that may yield lower rents will prompt a very expensive devaluation of the entire building. While if you maintain that vacant status quo, you won't get any angry phone calls from your lender or your accountant. And very often the lost rental income is tax deductible anyway. So instead of promoting vacancy, fiscal policy could prod owners to shift their views on vacant storefronts. but governments need to be a little bit careful because there might be a commercial property bubble that would pop in that case. Cities like New York are discussing taxing vacant storefronts, but cities like Washington, D.C., Cambridge, Massachusetts, and San Francisco already have these fiscal penalties. And they do really work. They address this sort of market failure where vacancy seems better than finding anything else. And they prod owners toward innovating. Again, the UK leads here. For years, they've had a vacancy tax that really prompt owners to think of new uses just because they have to. And it's not just having to. I think there is so much more to storefronts. The key to acceptance is showing new opportunities, that climate of change that Scott mentioned, which is what we as designers really excel at. First of all, we need to take a step back. This is that time for a reset. New opportunities to think back what a storefront actually does for a neighborhood, rather than the other way around, what a neighborhood could do for storefronts. So today I will give examples from throughout Europe and North America of storefronts as social infrastructure, health, wellness, and care centers, spaces for new ideas, for new objects, for art, and yes, also as residential spaces. But I'll get back about that topic a little later on. So let's start with social infrastructure. I want to present to you the idea of a storefront as a hub, not just for buying stuff, but increasingly, and we've already seen this over the past couple of years, for meeting other people. A great example of this is the Culture House in Boston. It's an organization, and they have created indoor pop-up spaces in vacant storefronts to, I quote, just hang out, places where someone can simply exist without spending money. These are indoor, non-transactional, free public spaces, which are great for Boston's cold climate. They are heavily programmed. This really helps bring life to areas like the Kendall Square Innovation Campus near MIT, which was a little dead at first. A biomedical real estate developer and owner of a vacant storefront said, sure, you can occupy the storefront if you can bring life to the area. And which is really what happened. Is this was a temporary filling that really built a stickiness, sticky public space where people linger and hang around in the area. The Culture House was a meeting space, a co-working space, a kids' play space, a lunch spot. And this program that ran for about a year really increased footfall, especially, by the way, among people of color and women at all times of the day. This is very much a model you also see in European storefronts. A little further afield in Boston, the Street Lab organization organized a temporary library space in Chinatown to show demand for a library space in this area of Boston. Cities built ultimately a permanent branch because of this. The libraries in general tend to be a little bit too big for a single storefront. But then again, this is a type of organization that's going through a bit of a reset. They're facing budget cuts generally. They're really soul searching their mission away from lending books to becoming working and meeting places. And those increasingly actually do fit into a storefront. But in general, again, these library spaces are much bigger than the average urban storefront, between like 1,000 and 2,500 square feet. So you do have this opportunity to also repurpose larger floor plate buildings like the library in Delft in the Netherlands, which was built out of a former supermarket and office complex upstairs. This was voted the best library in the Netherlands in 2009. And it really used that larger floor plate and actually has a new atrium in front of it that you can see on this slide over here, the dock center. And it now incorporates both lending, co-working, a media and music library, and various classes as well. So really good use for a central space with a larger floor plate. Another option is to see storefronts as places for health, wellness, and care. Because the US has an aging population, we have, thank God, for better and for worse, I guess, an increasing awareness of our health. And think of also of demographic shifts in certain areas like children. In the US, did you know that outpatient healthcare centers grew by over 50% between 2005 and 2016? this is a massive opportunity to come into storefronts. Urgent cares in the United States, but also, for instance, think of joint ventures with pharmacies. But when you place these up front into a storefront, of course, you'd have to think of how they interact with the sidewalk properly, moving waiting and reception areas up front. Needless to say, because of patient privacy, you would have to move the actual treatment areas to the back. Space can be tight as these practices tend to scale and have higher efficiency with scale. Demographics, family moving back into cities, there's a greater need for daycares as well. Daycare industry is a heavily regulated industry in general. You're looking at about 35 square foot per child, but if you have 1,000 square foot storefront, that already means you can put a class of 25 to 30 kids in there. Again, efficiency comes with scale. So in general, these daycare centers use more than one storefront. There's also issues if the spaces are too deep with daylighting, for instance. You can also think of daytime uses like indoor trampoline parks rented by the hour, which have become incredibly popular lately as kids try to get them out of the house. Also, more tentatively, of course, is the fitness and health salon space, which grew very, very rapidly before COVID, but is seeing significant online disruption right now. Storefronts are also very much spaces of production. The nature of work is one thing we're really learning now. It's changing, becoming more flexible, and storefronts can benefit. We can make the economy visible, a term coined by the Project for Public Spaces, making work more sociable. Research shows that productivity hinges on more than just focusing. It actually increasingly hinges on collaboration, socialization, and learning, which very much depends on interactivity that storefronts can offer, especially in the creative sector and in startups. For these storefront office spaces, you really need the right tenant, but also the right design guidelines and their enforcement. Think of, for instance, how much we like to work in coffee shops. It's sort of the most extroverted, flexible, and collaborative example of working. Spaces for new ideas in storefronts are drivers of innovation. Meetings, drivers of innovation. Think of increasingly the Silicon Valley firms that are banning canteens internally to force people to go to other places on the street in storefronts for lunch. This so-called managed serendipity has been put in practice in Eindhoven in the Netherlands, and all the innovation firms in this otherwise rather pretty standard research park has actually been moved into the strip in the center. Everyone has to go right there. One step up from the coffee shop and the lunch spot is the co-working space. There's a massive growth since the 2008 recession. In 2019 in the US, almost a third of new office leases is signed for a co-working lease model, and even a higher percentage in Europe. COVID has risen the interest in the co-working model because it lowers the risk for tenants. It's more flexible with a distributed working model. Expect a lot of shifts in this. Co-working is often focused around a community of interest and interaction. Again, it scales with efficiency, so it's usually larger than a single storefront, so you're going to need to use upstairs spaces. The trick really is to bring community functions to that storefront itself, like a coffee shop for outsiders, which is free for members of a co-working space. So here, for instance, is the example of Startwell in Toronto, Ontario, but it doesn't have to just be in bigger cities. Think of, for instance, the co-hatch above a food market in a fairly small town of Springfield, Ohio, as well. But don't forget the traditional office. The 1,000 to 2,500 square foot size of an average storefront can actually fit easily around 10 employees. Mind you, over 75% of American firms and nearly 85% of firms that operate mostly from desks are below 10 employees, and that number is even higher in the creative sector. Again, the trick is to keep office interactive with the street. Move the reception to the front. Attract businesses that need front spaces. Here we have a broker, Urban Fast Forward in Cincinnati, that very much wants to interact with the sidewalk, show off their latest plan, and welcome in guests. Here's the idea of marketing firm Sid Lee in Amsterdam, a very creative firm which actually combined their offices with a cafe and a shop of the products that they marketed right in the middle of the hippest district in Amsterdam. Here's, by the way, internally what that looks like. You see some retail spaces on the right and actually a meeting space to the left. You can also have spaces not to just make ideas, but make actual physical objects. And the spaces for making extends a centuries-old tradition of production and repair in cities and downtowns. We still see that as shoe repairs and framing shops, and we now also see the rise of the maker movement, very artisanal, small-scale, and blending that production and consumption. We need to ensure that makers can be of interest to the sidewalk, however, and that the sidewalk can be of interest to makers. This leaves really small startups, artisans that blend production and consumption. Like co-working spaces as well, the startup entrepreneurs can benefit from these incubators, maker spaces. Here I present the example of Make South Bend. It takes up 3 storefronts in the struggling retail strip in South Bend, Indiana, home of our future was a minister of transportation. Um, Mixture of making space in the back, there's a store in the front that actually sells the finished products. Maker spaces, again, are usually larger than storefronts. They also rarely turn a profit, which means they tend to co-locate with libraries or educational institutions. But foundation support can be very telling. Maker spaces are often related to the arts. Individual studios can actually be very small. They don't support the retail type rents, of course. They are a key element of the innovation ladder, higher up the entrepreneurial ladder for several reasons. City of Amsterdam in the Netherlands really understands this and has created an incubator breeding place policy with affordable rents and technical assistance for these smaller artists. Space is provided through this organization through brokers with closer ties to the arts movement, also the former squatting movement in Amsterdam as well. Here I present the example of the Westerdok, a new development in Amsterdam, where the developer actually said, retail is a following use. I'm going to give a 10-year lease agreement to artists to occupy my retail storefronts. And this is what it created, a so-called broedplaats or breeding place incubator for artists. Breeding, for instance, Create. I hope you can see that picture on the right. It's a social venture makerspace incubator. By the way, you sign a lease at below market rent, which does mean that the leases have a premise that spaces should enliven the sidewalks and tenants don't draw the blinds. You can make some demands for lower rent. Finally, let's talk a little bit about spaces for the arts. Storefronts are very visible and centrally located, so why just show merchandise? They're also excellent to show art as well. Beyond galleries, vacant storefronts can help the arts, and it's a win-win. Artists get the exposure for their artworks, and vacant storefronts get exposure for landlords to future tenants, and when done right, also have a lower risk of squatting and vandalism. Smart Space New York organization takes vacant storefronts for the arts, and their creative director, Ellen Scott, I quote, said, "We found the currency building owners care about most is cash, but not far behind that is publicity. Many recognize our public art mission and feel like they're doing a community good." The easiest thing to do is to just convince store owners of vacant storefronts to display art in their still closed spaces. For instance, think of San Francisco's Art in Storefronts program funded by the NEA in 2010, which ran for a couple of years. Hundreds of applicants for only 26 storefronts in the first year already. The program funded insurance, very, very important, and the storefront owners just funded the installation, access, and the electricity. Later, they also expanded to murals. Insurance is a bit of a sticking point for storefront owners. So a later program in Cambridge, Massachusetts actually said we're going to display only printed reproduction to have much lower insurance costs so that things would get stolen from storefronts. The next step is, of course, actually to open the space to display and sell the arts. Sasama in New York City has been convincing owners to do this since 1995, starting in the Times Square area. Now with dozens of spaces throughout the city. These are storefronts, also artist studios. Sasama is funded by, let's say, old real estate money in the Times Square area. But interesting, again, the model is finding the space, plugging the tenant through social media, through websites. But also very, very popular model, again, in the United Kingdom because of that vacancy tax. This is not just visual arts, painting and stuff. This is actually including dancing and performance. Be sure to check out Sasama's website. And yes, residential conversions as well. They seem the most logical solution. In fact, in high pressure markets, dwellings may now actually exceed the value of empty storefronts. But conversions from storefronts to residences can be very, very difficult to essentially because of a typological mismatch between retail and living. One really seeks exposure, the other seeks privacy. So how do you not just draw the blinds or brick up a storefront? One option is, for instance, creating horizontal distance, for instance, by placing the storefront back, as you can see on the picture on the left, for a covered front yard, or place actually a front yard right into the street. But it all depends on the context, what fits. And I really look forward to discussing some ideas with you. What matters is that we return, in general, to multi-use urban cores which truly involve consumption, but also production, socialization, and feeling at home. These visions are broader by design, which also builds economic resilience in time of a downturn. Just look at a shopping mall right now. They are in deep, deep trouble because they have only one use. We as designers and planners need to take a step back to think what storefronts can do to achieve these broader downtown visions, and then what we can do for our storefronts. Last but not least, be sure to check out work that I'm doing. I hope you recognize this is all a work in progress. This research is ongoing. A book I'm co-editing with Emily Talon, Street Life, the Future of Urban Retail, and the upcoming book, which is what most of this work features in, called Street Level Architecture, the Past, Present, and Future of Interactive Frontages. So with that, I thank you. Here's a little example of poetry, Dutch poetry, on a closed storefront. Again, it engages the passerby in a different and innovative way. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Conrad, and thanks to questions that have rolled in. Following Karin's presentation, we should have some time for questions and answers. So with that, Karin, welcome.
Great. Thank you, Scott. And that was awesome. Conrad, so many similar things. So I'm, our office is in downtown Los Angeles, and, downtown LA is really struggling right now with, I'm sure as many of the other urban centers from where all you folks are from, but between the restaurants and the bars going out of business, the retail that was already lagging before the pandemic, and the riots and boarding up storefront, is just a disaster. And eyes on the street and vitality on the street is the most important thing to keep an urban village successful. So a couple quick things. So I'm just going to go quickly. Omgivning, that's the company that I started 10 years ago. I've been focused on revitalizing urban centers for 20 years, primarily all downtown LA. Omgivning is a Swedish word that means the way a space feels. And we do a lot of, we do kind of this macro to micro approach to our architecture and interiors. On the macro side, we really work with the city and try to create incentives for developers and to incentivize reuse of these buildings and spaces, because it's so much more expensive than building new construction, which is kind of tricky. And on the micro side, again, it's about how a space feels. So it's those little details of things inside. So we also design furniture and lighting and are really into human-centered design, wellness, and all that kind of stuff. Lots of good stuff. So just throwing out a couple of projects of that were kind of our adaptive reuse projects. We do a lot of historic high-rise conversions to housing that were typically banks with offices above. This one in particular, the attic was kind of a low space, and so we ripped off the attic, as you can see in the top right image, and the section you can see we with the developers pushing maxed out the square footage that you could possibly do on the top, and still got historic tax credits, which was pretty monumental for an addition that huge. This is a church that we're working on in Pasadena. The actual church itself will probably be an event space. The main space would be an event space, and the little chapel will probably be a restaurant cafe, but the remainder of the building, say classrooms, and they had Sunday school and cafeteria and common spaces, will all be converted to housing and different amenities. So that's always fun. This actually had a small theater in it, this building on Broadway, and offices, but this is what the light courts looked like before. And instead of keeping the corridors in the building, which is more normal, being that we're in Southern California of good weather, we put the circulation to the unit entry as kind of bridges and walkways within the light court to kind of engage and create a sense of community, and also have better light and ventilation as well through the units. This was a jail. We were second place for this project, but it was a really great project to just convert a jail to housing and all sorts of mixed use, and really to create a full community on this site with new construction and the adaptive reuse. And then the last project, the biggest one, this is almost 2 million square feet. There's a few old Sears distribution centers around the country. This is the one in Los Angeles. And we have a scheme that's permitted and ready to start construction, although I think it's stalled. So if anybody who wants to buy this massive building, it can have 1,000 units, all sorts of retail, a site park, a food hall, office, like definitely its own city neighborhood in itself. This massive building. So the idea is, to kind of carve into these various areas to get the housing in there. Okay, so yeah, and Scott talked about, the state that we're in right now: social and racial crisis, climate crisis, public health crisis. Starting in April, and I think about April through July, we decided, since a lot of our billable work was down, to take that, let's call it, quote, opportunity to really think about what was going to be changing. And since we're a firm that focuses on adaptive reuse, we really wanted to think about what's changing in the spaces, specifically how the ones that are underutilized, and how they'll be changing in the future. So we did a report, a design charrette, internal kind of workshop, and then we put it in a report format. So we did one on workplace, one on multifamily, and then one that we're calling urban reprogramming, but that's the one that was primarily about underutilized spaces, specifically retail and commercial. And what was interesting was that in all three of them, these four kind of themes kept coming up over and over again. So human-centered design, like we know we really need to be more focused in now on human-centered design. Anybody that's been stuck in one location, or been stuck alone, or stuck with a bunch of people in one space, or whatever, all the things that we need for really good human-centered design, whether it be wellness, whether it be private space as well as social spaces, whether it be biophilia, connection to nature, all those kinds of things, and flexibility, adaptability. So it goes beyond just adaptive reuse. It's, I think, the ability to be able to change our environments, and the flexibility for that to be an easy thing. And that goes, I think, with everything that we can do in our lives from now on. Our lives are too complicated and too needing things right away, right? So our spaces have to be able to reflect that need for change. Blended uses, and Conrad talked about a lot of really great blended use ideas with some of the storefronts. But going beyond just mixed use that we're used to hearing about in multifamily, and into blended uses, and how you can do multiple things in one space, so they all overlap. And then economic context, we're not in the good times. The good times aren't rolling anymore. And it's just, I think, it's just inherent the way our society works. There's good times, there's bad times, but we need to be more aware and focus on how to think about our economic context in everything we do. And I think a lot of that comes out of the flexibility and adaptability. But in order to have, equity, we need to be able to really be thinking much more about economic context. So, okay. So the first thing, I'll just kind of do workspaces quickly because it was a little bit less about adaptive reuse, but some things that we definitely saw, or let me just describe the diagram here. So on the top right is kind of your standard, kind of office layout from before, open plan, blah, blah, blah. A few offices that were built in, but then primarily open plan. So some things that I think we've learned, and all of the many webinars and seminars that I've attended in the last 9 months kind of confirm. So we're not necessarily going to need less square footage for workspace. There's a lot of controversy on that, but I think that the verdict is out, and it really depends on office by office. But there is confirmation that between 30 to even 60% of the office workforce will continue to work from home, at least part-time. So that obviously changes significantly. So whereas, before you had this huge open office, and by the way, those people weren't on Zoom calls all day. And even when we go back, we're still going to be on Zoom calls, because you might have 2 people remote and 3 people in the office and 2 consultants that are remote or whatever it is. So that open office definitely is going to be changing. But one scenario, and we studied a bunch of different scenarios. One scenario is, what if the office becomes really more of a place to gather? So it's not about having a bunch of desk spaces, but it's about more about collaboration spaces and meeting room spaces and things like that. Oops. So, okay, let's go through some of the building types that one in particular is light industrial, which it probably depends on where you are in different parts of the country, but just outside of downtown Los Angeles, we have literally thousands of buildings that kind of look like this, 1 story, usually bow truss. So they're really beautiful bow truss buildings, single span. So this is kind of chopped into 2 bays here. These buildings tend to not have any pedestrian experience. So they're really just these, warehouses basically. So we looked at how these buildings can be reused. So obviously a lot of them will eventually be torn down and will be densifying, and that's totally fine. But we don't want to remove all of them. We need to keep a lot of them, and they're really beautiful buildings. The concrete floors and the brick walls and the bow truss building ceilings. So 2 things we looked at. One, again, with this building type, since it's less of a pedestrian experience and more of an internal experience, the idea of workplace, which really is not a far stretch for these areas, because zoning usually allows for them also to be workspace. This is actually a model of a building that we're trying, or a workspace that we're trying to use as a concept for our next location. And it would be buying a building, about 20,000 square feet. And it's not co-working and it's not private office. It's kind of a blend. So you basically create a sense of community within the building, and maybe there's 2 to 6 tenants, and then you share all the common areas. So anything that's not like you at a physical desk would be you in these common areas. So sharing that cost of the office, as well as utilizing the space in a better way. The same building is just, here's an example showing it going into housing. So again, it's more of a community driven kind of housing project, because it doesn't really have that engagement with the pedestrian street outside. So let's look at an example of a ground floor retail in, say, downtown LA, or an urban space. So this is showing a commercial area here on the left, which has been, unoccupied for a long time. This is a big multifamily project that we worked on. The interiors in our offices down the street. The rest of the ground floor is basically their lobby and parking. But how can we be rethinking some of these ground floor spaces? So this was one idea of actually sharing a hybrid restaurant and office space, being that when you think about office spaces these days, a lot of their common areas within their office feel very much like a restaurant these days. There's beautiful breakouts, sessions, locations, and tables and chairs, and very cafe style. And they usually have a bar, and there's gorgeous conference rooms. So if you really think about how that use could work with an office, whether it be shared operators, or maybe 2 different operators, and then they use different times of the day, in terms of how they use that space. And very much in regards to what Conrad was talking about with maker spaces. You know, this was one idea that you could have, say, one operator who takes the lease of that entire space, subdivides it into much smaller spaces, which could all be makers. They could be live work maker spaces, or they could just be, you know, no live in that potential. But again, you've got eyes on the street, you've got a, you know, connection for commerce, and then for the production of their making behind, as well as a collective, which helps you know, make that even more vibrant. And also we were looking at this based on the you know, the food hall kind of concept, or, you know, jewelry centers, or these places that are successful because they can kind of have a collective of people of kind of the same tribe, you know, but they can all have smaller spaces, so they're more affordable. A lot of makers, you know, that they could probably afford 400 square foot space, and especially if there's some management of a larger entity that can help them with social media or different advertising, that could be helpful. When we looked at our multifamily stuff, you know, we do a lot of these urban adaptive reuse. So we always maximize the roof, and the roof is always a big deal, like, you know, putting all the amenities on the roof. But the thing we wanted to explore here was how we could potentially use the ground floor. And in terms of rethinking residential spaces and how the ground floor could be used for those amenities, as well as community aspects. So, you know, you normally have the restaurant bar or the cafe, but mixing that maybe with a kind of a either retail pop-ups, or it could be a commerce area like a general store that has some relation to the residents that are in the building. There's so many people that are kind of creating their own products or services, and whether it be co-working or other programmatic ideas, that they can be shared with the residents and the neighbors. So then it not only creates a better community within the building and those residents, but with the neighborhood as a whole. And again, using that ground floor space, which sometimes isn't utilized as well. And the last two projects are a case studies of retail. So, you know, living in Los Angeles, there are, I think, what was the number, 675 mini malls. And, you know, obviously a lot of them are getting more and more underutilized. On the left shows the existing condition. This one happens to be an L-shaped, and it happens to have below grade parking as well as surface parking. Well, it's such a no-brainer really to think about how that surface parking or could become the public garden kind of area, courtyard, you know, some, you know, lush landscaping along the perimeter to really create that sense of shelter and safety. And then just as you currently right now, say, have the retail stores which engage with that parking lot, instead it would be small skinny units that would engage with that garden, and it kind of works out with the second floor in the same way. Very easy to reuse, circulation, and everything else that's going on there. And then the last one, so on the left, it shows, this is a site, again, this is still in Los Angeles, because Los Angeles does have a little bit more, some areas that are more suburban. So here's a massive Costco, an empty Toys R Us. By the way, there's 800 empty Toys R Us's around the country now, and a Best Buy. And on the left just shows how these three big box buildings could be carved in with courtyards and create some really great housing. The front part, the existing retail along the commercial street could stay with some infill residential, new construction here, you know, maybe 6 stories or so. And then the space between really could be great sport courts and much more community oriented. And on the right is just showing how to potentially take just the Costco. So this could yield 110 kind of large family units. They'd each be townhomes built within the roof structure. There would be a lot of new fenestration along the perimeters, and then 2 big kind of courtyards carved in the middle to create some of those public outdoor spaces and adjacent in conjunction with all the private outdoor spaces. Oof, okay, there's a lot. There's so much to do. We've all got a lot of work to do. So thank you very much.
Right. Thank you, Karin. We do have a few questions. We have a few minutes for questions. And one for you, Karin, from Stephanie Reich. She says, Karin, I love your work and presentation. These ideas are super interesting. Is there a special kind of client that will allow you to be this inventive?
It's definitely not subsidized or public money. I can tell you that, because there are so many restrictions with most public or subsidized funding. There are tax credits that can allow a lot of flexibility, because they really don't pay attention so much to programming, or at least historic tax credits don't. But I think, you're really talking about the private developer, and with the private developer, they either need to have incentives that are provided by the city, or like Conrad was talking about, if there was incentives, I forget, was it a tax break, or was it, no, it was a tax.
It was a tax penalty, actually.
Yeah, I'm going to absolutely bring that to some folks in LA, because, okay, of course, right now asking for extra money from people is tough across the board, but yeah.
Another question from a couple people here, and Nico and Stephanie both have a similar question. And the question is about the financial viability of redesigning the big box facility. Does it really make sense to adaptively reuse it, or would it be better to raise it and start it over again?
Well, I think it depends on how, what the building is and how you can reuse it. So I think a lot of times people come in with adaptive reuse with a big hammer, like in their idea, we're going to do this, instead of kind of working backwards from really looking at the building, listening to the building, what it wants to be, what it can easily become, and then working with the building. So I think that is a really good way to look at adaptive reuse. And then in terms of, thinking about sustainability and a lot of the other factors that may be important to certain developers that might help them overcome, I don't want to say, let's just say, some of the constraints financially, what you're saving by not tearing down the building, both in cost and in terms of, carbon footprint, is enormous.
All right, thank you. There's a question that might apply to both of you, and that is about this issue about office space and whether we need more or less for the same. Nico comments that there seems to be reasonable arguments in all directions.
Maybe I can I try to answer from maybe an international perspective. So, working from home is quite novel in American corporate culture, but many European countries have had this working from home culture for quite a few years. The Netherlands has really adopted this over the past couple of years, mostly, to be honest, just to save money, essentially, right? So that to allow people to work from home and in flexible spaces. We did actually see a decline in the amount of office spaces. We've also just seen a shift. People now start working in coffee shops and in smaller co-working communities. So that's where I see the opportunity, right? It's like we can move some of this to street level to try and activate some of these spaces. So that's the experience I've seen over the past couple of years, and let's just presume that that would count here as well as working from home increases.
And I think what we're
Karin,
seeing,
what do you think?
yeah, and I think specifically, during the pandemic and post-COVID, that there's going to be, obviously a huge jump in working from home, which can decrease the amount of square footage in offices. But again, it really depends on the type. What we're also hearing from a lot of companies is that they'd like to have more satellite, smaller offices. So that, say, there could be groups, like even in Los Angeles, because you still don't want to sit for an hour and a half in traffic if you live in Orange County and you work in downtown LA, that maybe there's smaller offices around, and just realizing how easy it is to connect virtually those smaller offices to the bigger office, or the bigger office stays as it is, but again, it becomes more of a true gathering, collaborative space, and definitely less workstations.
So there's a question for Karin from Christy Holland. It says, looking at the site, beautiful. I love how your dogs are listed as staff. However, I don't see any work with low-income urban areas or staff. We see plenty of vacancies, low-income urban areas, especially in legacy cities. What are you both doing to retrofit support resiliency for these areas?
So I think that for us with adaptive reuse, there has been less subsidy for affordable housing, and it's not mandated because they've focused on adaptive reuse in Los Angeles more through developer incentives. But the developer incentives have really only helped to level the playing field as opposed to giving any additional profit that they could put towards affordable housing, because the costs of retrofitting the buildings, especially for seismic as well as all the fire life safety issues, have made the costs per square foot pretty high. We have worked on a few affordable housing adaptive reuse, and we're starting to see more for sure post-COVID. And they are changing the zoning so that micro lofts will be allowed, because that was kind of you'd have to get entitlements and variances in order to do micro units. And we feel that micro units is a great way to, without subsidies, public subsidies, to be able to create more affordable units. Because right now there's like all the units in downtown are really similar in terms of their cost and their size. You got to have diversity.
So I will comment slightly because I know that you know, I've gotten a couple of questions on the financial implications of some of these uses. The vacancy tax doesn't cost the government anything. I mean, it makes them a little bit, but they're not supposed to, right? It's supposed to prod owners to do something. In the UK, actually, what's happened is in some of these very peripheral areas, it really has been successful, because storefront owners will just take the haircut, take the loss, and say, okay, I'm done with this penalty. I'll just do something else with it. You have to also remember, a lot of these uses I mentioned, they are not revenue generating as much as a retail storefront occupied would be, but it's again about acceptance. They're not coming back. So you can either just have zero revenue and with these you know, tax policy essentially pay a penalty, or you can take at least something. I mean, other than the culture house ideas, these are revenue generating ideas in general. They are at a lower level than retail rents. But they do support refitting a storefront. These tend to not be things that require a lot of public subsidy, with the exception, again, right? Social spaces, maker spaces. I will say a lot of those are foundation supported as well. It tends to be foundations that want to focus on entrepreneurship.
Okay, but time for one more quick question, and I think one for Karin would be, did you look at, this is from Thomas Poupard, did you look at dead anchor spaces in closed malls?
We are actually right now working on a mall reuse, and they want to keep it a mall, but basically take one of the anchors and do a whole new reuse into that. I can't get them to think about residential yet, but they're going to put residential in the surface parking lot. So that's great. And then a lot more kind of community-based experiences or uses within the mall, so that it can be more of a holistic place to go as opposed to just for retail.
I will say a big thing in I know I'll be very quick. A big thing in Ohio has been transforming those anchors to distribution centers, right, for e-commerce.
Mm-hmm.
This has been a really great conversation. I just want to remind folks that we have a number of webinars that we're still scheduling for January and February, thinking about curb adjacent activities that are happening, as well as working with folks from the Urban Land Institute and thinking about how all of the disruption happening impacts parking, along with much more. And of course, in just a few more months, we will be hosting again the Urbanism Next Virtual Forum, March 17th through 19th. So we're hoping folks can join us there. Make sure that you stay connected to our website, where we'll have all of that information. So Scott, Karin, and Conrad, thank you all again, and very happy holidays.
Thank you. Have a great one, everybody.